Hello and welcome to the Grandfather's Cave. In this video I want to talk about how I use and how I make land and city maps for my RPG games. To start with, a disclaimer: I'm no professional at making maps. There are people out there who are way better than me, and therefore I want to give a shout out to JP Coovert, to MapCrow, to WASD20 and Pen and Blade, who have fantastical tutorials on how to draw maps. I will post a link to their channels in the description of this video. I will also put in a link to a site that allows you to create randomly generated maps. To start off, my approach to map making is very inspired by a really great book that I bought as one of my first RPG supplements. The book is The Forgotten Realms Adventures from 1990. It's a hardcover book by Grubb and Ed Greenwood. And aside from a lot of really wonderful art from Larry Elmore and Dameron and Clyde, Caldwell, Jeff Easley, it also has a lot of maps made by Dave Diesel LaForge, who was a very proliferous cartographer and map artist for TSR back in the day. As you might see when you look at my maps later, they're very inspired by Diesel's maps of the Forgotten Realms. While Diesel's maps are pretty simple, I thought they were very illustrative. It was easy to see where things were, where you would find forest, hills, mountain, and things like that. Aside from the large map of the Heartlands, there are also maps of the cities. Cities from small towns like Shadowdale to big metropolises like Baldur's Gate and Central Keep. They of course have different styles, and I would do some things different, but his style of making city maps has really inspired me a lot, which you will probably also be able to see on what I'm doing. If we're going to look at what I make for maps, I will start out with this piece of scrap paper. It's from a campaign that I'm starting, and it's centered around a village called Grey Barrow. It is very small, and I just started out with the thought that, well, it has to have a market, it's going to be central, and there are a bunch of houses there, and there are two main roads leading up. That's all I needed to know. I already had a map of the larger area around Grey Barrow, so I didn't have to worry about that to start with. But I wanted to have some industry, a smithy, a market, and stuff like that, and I jotted them down. And as you can see down here in the corner, I also situated Grey Barrow geographically. To the north, you can see I've drawn some hills, and to the south, there's a blob, which represents a swampy area and a forest. And then I've drawn a straight line to the nearest larger settlement in the east. As you can see, I have put some measurements in days, 2 days and 3 days. That's how long I expect a character would normally need to travel on foot from one location to the other. You need to know how far a person can travel and how far they are from one town to another. But as a GM, I think it's much more useful to have a scale that says how long is that distance in miles, for instance, and how long is it in days of travel, because then I can just skip a lot of the calculations when I'm playing the game. I can look at the map and ballpark it pretty easy and say, yeah, that's 5 days from A to B. Aside from this rough sketch, I've also produced this smaller map here, which is both a handout and an aid to the players. You can see that I've drawn the map on a hexagonal grid, and that's also because I want the players to embark on some exploration in a West Marches style. So you can see that there's the city, there are a couple of small sites like some ruins and some standing stones, there's a castle. This is something that I'm going to hand to the players and let them fill it out. But this small map is actually inspired from this greater map, which I referred to earlier. You can see there is the town of Grey Barrow here in the western part of the map, and a straight line to the east to the nearest larger settlement. This map actually informs many of my choices about the small town of Grey Barrow. Why is it there and why it is important? Well, it's a mining town because it's in the hills. Mining is important in this kingdom because they like to export it as well. So it's necessary that they have some mines. And of course, Grey Barrow would be one of those mining towns. But you can also see that aside from some larger cities in the south, in the center, in the east, there's not a lot going on in this map. I've drawn some red dotted lines, which are roads. I have put in some markers for castles, but there's not a lot of goings on other than the geographical features. The mountain chains, the forests, the islands, the coastal lines. And that's because I don't like to clutter my map with 100 smaller locations, because then the map becomes useless. It becomes a bit like one of those maps in Skyrim when you've been playing like 200 hours, where you have located almost all locations on the map, and it just becomes a hassle to figure out what is where. So I like to keep my map pretty clean. And as you can see, I'm not as good as many of the mappers out here on YouTube, but I think I'm doing quite okay. And I will let you in on how I make my maps. When I started making my map, I actually just started with a small location. And then as the game evolved, my map also evolved organically. I had some rough ideas about where was the capital, what kind of kingdom was this, and were there some neighboring countries and important geographical features. I just started expanding on the map with that knowledge, and many of the things were improvised and added on later. Eventually, when I had filled in the map and my players wanted to travel further outside, then I just added a second piece of paper and just continued the map in that direction. One map became 2, and 2 maps became 8, and they can all be put together to form a larger map. These 2 here are relatively finished. I'm not going to do much about them now. But there are other parts of the continent that I have not finished. This map here is halfway done. I have drawn lines of the coast in pencil, and then I've used a micron pen to highlight it in black. Then I've used colored crayons to color the map in so we can see what are forests, what are mountains, what are deserts. As always, of course, I added a compass rose. But aside from this, I also have this see-through paper on which I write a lot of names and put in some locations, because I'm not always ready to commit to a name or a location. And therefore it's easier for me just to add it to the see-through paper, and then when I'm done and satisfied, I can transfer that information to the actual map. That is something I would advise to do. If I go back to one of the earlier maps, you can see that I had the coastline here drawn in with the black micron, and I had used the crayons to color in the hills and the mountains and the forests. Having decided on this map being as complete as I wanted it to be, I took my thin coloring pens and started adding in details. I made a border for the forests so it was better defined, and I also started adding in some treetops. I also used the pens to give some more definition to hills, to the mountains, and put in the names of the locations that I had decided upon. And I also went on to add an extra wavy line along the shores to make the coastline look better. As you can see, it really doesn't take a lot to make a good map. You basically just have to start drawing some lines. Where do you want a city? Where do you want a coastline? Where do you want a river? And when you have those things in place, you can just start coloring it in. And if you use the methods that you will find in many of the maps, like these small pyramids for hills or mountains, and the wavy green blobs for forests, then you will have a pretty good map. I always make considerations about geography. If you have a mountain, then there will likely be a river running from the mountain to the coast. If you do that, then you will have rivers that make sense. Often you will find forests close to mountains because mountains cause precipitation. Put in some forests close to the mountains, not necessarily on both sides of the mountain, because the precipitation is often more concentrated on one side than the other. Things like that might inform you on how you want your map to be. But of course, if you're playing a fantasy game, you might want to have fantasy features as well. Just like I've done with this one map, where I have a forest, where I have a lot of crystal formations in the middle of the forest that are, of course, fantastic in nature. Or this area here, which is a kind of barren tundra in the middle of nowhere. And this is a huge crater. Nobody knows why it's there, but there's a city in there. I just wanted a city in the middle of this gigantic crater, so there it is. I would always encourage a GM to try to find a logical reason for why a settlement can sustain itself. It doesn't have to be logical in the sense that we know from our world, but you have to make some fantasy logic that can apply to that settlement. The great thing about having these maps is that when players, they start asking me questions about the world, then I can say, yeah, to the north there's this and that forest, there's another country, there are these sorts of people living there. So the location the players are at seems more alive and connected to a larger world. With that said, I don't think that you should start making cities and politics and God knows what level of detail for places where your players are not currently adventuring. Start local, but have an idea of what surrounds your players. I also really like using maps as handouts. And in my last campaign, I used these maps. They made it easier for the players to find out where they were and make decisions about where they wanted to go. This particular map zooms in on the central area where most of the game was taking place. And as you can see, this is also very devoid of details. There are some locations marked here and there that the players have not explored yet, but I wanted it to be this way so that the players can start adding in locations when they discover them. It will make the map a bit more theirs and will make it easier for them both to recall what they have done in the past and make decisions about what they want to do in the future. And speaking of handouts, I have at one point also made this map of an island. It's a bit inspired by the Isle of Dread. It's a nice little tropical island. One thing that was very interesting is that I made this other map because when they discovered the island, they had first had it revealed through a magical projector, and therefore I made this map as well, which is basically identical to the other map except that I colored in different colors. I used an alternate alphabet, so that was pretty cool actually when the players discovered this projector and found out, oh, this is this item is actually a map. But it doesn't have to be difficult to make handouts for a game. As you can see here, this is actually a map that I tore up in pieces and had the players discover the different pieces of the map one at a time. So that was actually kind of a treasure hunt, finding the map itself. It does not have to be very precise or nice looking if it's a map that you want to use as a handout, because you must remember, it's not always a master cartographer that makes these. It might be your average Joe that jots some things down and the players just happen to find them. It's pretty easy to make something that will be useful for the players. And having a handout is having an artifact from the fantasy world. It's something that makes the adventures a bit more real for your players. So whenever you can make a handout, do it. And a great opportunity for making handouts are maps. Now let's take a look at some city maps. This one here is a map of a very small town dominated by a large monastery. It has a bit more detail than most of my city maps have, but the thinking behind how I did this map is the same as it is when I zoom out and do it with less detail. An example of that is this city map of Belde. Here you can see that I'm copying a bit the style of Diesel's city maps. One difference is that I have only jotted in the most important buildings. I will probably not be making a tiny box for each and every house in the city. When I do that, it will probably just be because I want to add streets to the city. Right now in this map, you can see that I have drawn some major roads into the city, and these are the main thoroughfares through the settlement. But of course, there are a lot of small crisscrossing streets and alleyways. I'm not putting these in here because that's information that I really don't need to run a game in the city. But if I happen to have a small street that becomes important, then I will just add it at that time. And if it's not sufficiently large for me to draw in, then I could just hint at the presence of this alley or street by drawing some houses and having some space between them. Then it would be obvious that, yeah, there's a path there between the houses. This one is probably more representative of how I do towns and cities now. As you can see in this, I have drawn a couple of roads leading into the town, but when we get into the town, the streets or alleys, they're just hinted at by the location of the houses. So that's an example of what I was trying to say before about using houses to illustrate where there is a street. Well, this was much longer than I had anticipated. I just wanted to make a short video about maps, but I got carried away, as I usually do when doing something with maps. The next video is probably going to be a video about dungeon maps. I hope you found the content of this video entertaining, that you enjoyed it, and that you will like and subscribe. And until next time, keep slaying.